Welcome back to 1316 Trigonometry. We're dealing with Chapter 1, Section 4, Introduction to Identities. I'm David Dipple of Lone Star College, Montgomery. First thing we need to look at is what an identity is, and that is a statement that is always true. We have ratios and reciprocal identities that we've already covered. We just didn't discuss them as being identities. The four that we've already looked at are tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant. Tangent as a ratio, as a fraction, is sine over cosine. Secant as a fraction is 1 over cosine. Cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, cosine over sine, and cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So those are reciprocals and ratios as far as identities go. Now, the Pythagorean identities are all related to the Pythagorean theorem. We know that x squared plus y squared is equal to r squared from a triangle where x and y are your two sides and r is your hypotenuse. Now, if we divide by r squared, all three terms, we get x squared over r squared plus y squared over r squared is equal to 1. Now, in the last video, we had points x, y, and we found out that the x and the y are related to sine and cosine. So x squared over r squared is going to be cosine squared. Y squared over r squared is going to be sine squared, and that's equal to 1. Now that's an identity that you need to memorize. Just like you've already memorized x squared plus y squared equals r squared, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagorean theorem, you need to memorize cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1. Now, if we rearrange these slightly and put the sine first for a moment, and then divide by cosine squared, so you have sine squared divided by cosine squared divided by cosine squared, and 1 divided by cosine squared. This fraction, we already have a definition for sine over cosine, is tangent, and it's going to be squared. Cosine over cosine is 1, and 1 over cosine is secant. So tan squared plus 1 is equal to secant squared. That's a second Pythagorean identity for trigonometry that we need to memorize. So tan squared plus 1 is secant squared. And you can rearrange this, move the 1 over with the secant, and have tan squared is secant squared minus 1. These can be algebraically manipulated. Now, if we go back to our cosine squared plus sine squared is 1, and we divide by sine squared, we get cosine squared divided by sine squared divided by sine squared equals 1 divided by sine squared. This fraction, cosine over sine, is cotangent. This is 1, and that's cosecant. So we have cotan squared plus 1 is cosecant squared. And again, that's the third Pythagorean identity that we need to memorize. So you have sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. That's the first one. Tan squared plus 1 is secant squared, and cotan squared plus 1 is cosecant squared. And again, these can be algebraically manipulated. Sine can move over here. Cosine squared is 1 minus sine squared. The 1 can move, tangent can move, whatever. Now, in section 4, they're also going to give you a value, for instance, of sine theta is 4/7. And they give you a quadrant, second quadrant, and they want you to figure out all the other trig functions, what the numerical values are going to be. Now, the easiest way to do this is to draw a triangle in specifically quadrant 2. So, if I draw quadrant 2, and I put a triangle in quadrant 2, my angle is going to be down here, touching the x-axis, and going up to some line that I arbitrarily drew in there. I don't know how big the angle is. I just know it's going to be down here. Then I know sine is opposite divided by the hypotenuse. So if I put my theta down here inside the blue triangle that I drew, opposite is 4 and hypotenuse is 7. Now, using Pythagorean theorem, 7 squared is 49. 4 squared is 16. So you have 49 minus 16 is 33. You square root it, And since we're going to the left, that's negative. So it's negative square root of 33. Now, giving all of these numerical values, we can plug in for cosine, for tangent, cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, which is negative square root of 33 over 7. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, 4 over the square root of 33, and it's negative. I'll put the negative on the top. Cosecant is sine flipped over the reciprocal of sine, so it's going to be 7 over 4. Here's your sine value. Secant, you just take your cosine value, flip it over. I again put the negative on the top, negative 7 over the square root of 33. Cotangent, I take my tangent value, the negative 4 in the square root of 33, flip it over, find its reciprocal, negative square root of 33 over 4. So anytime you're working with values that you're given, draw a triangle. In this case, I put it in the second quadrant. If it says first quadrant, draw one in the first quadrant. Make sure your angle goes between the x-axis and the side that you drew in. So we draw a side inside our quadrant first, and then angle goes from that side down to the x-axis. Don't ever go sideways. And those are all the bits of information that you'll need for section 4. Again, that's working with some identities. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Tan squared plus 1 is secant squared. Cotan squared plus 1 is cosecant squared. And then, given a value in a particular quadrant, drawing a triangle and finding various trig functions.